Pack your things. This isn't your house anymore. Those were the words my daughter-in-law said to me in my own living room, just 3 weeks after I signed the papers that gave my house to my son, and for a moment, I truly believed I had misheard her, because just a month earlier, I was standing in that same room watching sunlight pour through the bay windows, thinking I had finally secured my future, thinking I had done the right thing for my family, thinking I was safe. My name is Evelyn Harper. I'm 70 years old, and until recently, I believed that if you spent your life loving your child, supporting him, sacrificing quietly in ways no one ever sees, then one day, when you needed that love returned, it would be there waiting for you like a warm light in a dark room. That's what I believed the morning I signed my house over to my son, Michael. I remember the pen in my hand, the way it felt heavier than it should have, as if somewhere deep inside me, something was hesitating, trying to slow me down, but I pushed that feeling aside because Michael was smiling, telling me this was just a smart move, that it would make things easier for all of us, that I would never have to worry about anything again. Vanessa, his wife, stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm, nodding with that soft, reassuring smile she always used when she wanted something to feel harmless. They told me I would always have a place there, that this would always be my home, that nothing would change except the paperwork. And I believed them because I wanted to believe them. Because after my husband passed 3 years ago, the house had felt too quiet, too large, and the idea of not having to manage everything alone anymore sounded like relief, like finally setting down a weight I had carried for decades. That afternoon, after the documents were signed, we sat around the kitchen table, drinking coffee, talking about small renovations, maybe repainting the walls, updating the guest room, things that sounded normal, harmless, even hopeful. I remember Vanessa laughing about turning one of the rooms into a nursery someday, and I smiled, imagining grandchildren running down the hallway, filling the silence my husband had left behind. For a little while, it felt like the beginning of something good. But small things started to change, so quietly at first that I almost convinced myself they didn't matter. The following week, Vanessa suggested I move my things out of the master bedroom, saying it would be better for Michael's back, that he needed more space, and she said it so gently, so reasonably, that I found myself agreeing before I had time to think about what I was giving up. Then came the garage, where my old boxes were rearranged without asking, and the kitchen, where my usual place at the table somehow shifted until I was sitting at the corner instead of the head, like a guest in a house I had built with my husband's hands and my own. Michael didn't say much during these moments. He would glance at Vanessa, then at me, and offer a small, apologetic smile, as if that was enough to smooth over the feeling that something was slowly slipping away. I told myself it was just an adjustment, that families change, that I needed to be flexible, that this was the price of not being alone. But standing there now, hearing those words, "This isn't your house anymore," I realized the truth had been unfolding all along, one quiet moment at a time, and I had been too willing, too trusting, too eager to believe that love alone could protect me from what was coming. That night, I did not argue with her. I did not raise my voice, and I did not ask my son to explain, because something inside me had already gone quiet in a way that felt deeper than anger. So I simply nodded once and walked toward the small guest room at the end of the hallway, the one that used to be my sewing room, the one with the narrow window that faced the neighbor's fence instead of the street, and I closed the door behind me as gently as I could, as if making noise would somehow make everything more real than it already was. The house sounded different after that, and I noticed it immediately, the way the floorboards creaked without the familiar rhythm I had known for years, the way voices carried differently through the walls, lower now, more private, like conversations that no longer belonged to me. I sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress still stiff because it had never really been used before, and I looked around at the few things I had brought in earlier that week, a small suitcase, a framed photograph of my husband, and a folded quilt that I had sewn myself decades ago, back when Michael was just a boy running through these rooms with scraped knees and endless questions. It was strange how quickly a place could stop feeling like yours, how something as simple as a sentence could redraw every boundary you thought you understood. I remember listening to their voices from down the hall that evening, Vanessa speaking first, her tone calm but firm, explaining something about repainting and reorganizing, about how it would be better for everyone if certain spaces were used more efficiently. And Michael agreeing in that quiet way he had developed over the years, not quite confident, not quite uncertain, just enough to let things move forward without resistance. At one point, I heard my name, followed by a pause, and then a softer voice, as if they were lowering it on purpose, and I realized they were discussing me the same way people discuss furniture, something that needed to be moved, adjusted, or eventually removed when it no longer fit the design. I did not cry that night, not because I was strong, but because the feeling had not reached tears yet. It was still sitting somewhere deeper, heavier, like a stone settling at the bottom of a lake. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise out of habit, the same way I had for years when my husband was alive, and for a moment, I forgot where I was, expecting to hear the sound of coffee brewing in the kitchen and the low hum of the morning news. But instead there was only silence, broken occasionally by the distant sound of a car passing outside. I got dressed slowly, choosing a simple sweater and slacks, and when I stepped into the hallway, I noticed that the door to the master bedroom was closed, something that had never happened before when it was mine, and there was a new lock on it. Small but unmistakable, catching the light just enough to draw my attention. I stood there, longer than I should have, looking at that door, remembering the years behind it, the conversations, the quiet evenings, the life I had built piece by piece, and then I turned away and walked to the kitchen. Vanessa was already there, standing by the counter with her phone in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other, and she glanced at me briefly before returning her attention to the screen, offering a polite smile that did not quite reach her eyes. There was no invitation to sit, no question about how I had slept, just a kind of distant acknowledgement, like we were two people sharing a space by coincidence rather than family by design. Michael came in a few minutes later, adjusting his tie, moving quickly, and when he saw me, he hesitated for a second, then said good morning in a tone that felt rehearsed, as if he had practiced it on his way down the stairs. I nodded back, matching his simplicity, because anything more would have felt like asking for something I was no longer sure I was allowed to have. I made myself a cup of coffee, the same way I always had, measuring it carefully, pouring it into my favorite mug, the one with a small chip on the handle, and I sat at the far end of the table without being told, because I already understood that this was where I belonged now. As I sat there, watching the two of them move through the kitchen, discussing their plans for the day, their schedules, their priorities, I began to see the shape of something I had not wanted to recognize before. Something that had been forming quietly beneath every small change, every polite request, every gentle suggestion that had slowly taken pieces of my life and rearranged them into something unrecognizable. And for the first time since I signed those papers, I allowed myself to consider a thought that felt both frightening and strangely steady at the same time, that maybe this was not a misunderstanding, maybe this was exactly what it looked like. And maybe the safety I thought I had secured was never there to begin with. By the third day, I began to notice patterns that I could no longer dismiss as simple adjustments, and it was not anything loud or obvious, it was the quiet consistency of small decisions being made without me, decisions that slowly redrew the shape of my daily life until there was very little of it left that still felt like my own. Vanessa had started keeping a list on the refrigerator, a neat column of tasks and reminders written in careful handwriting, things like grocery items, appointments, and household rules, and at first I thought it was just her way of staying organized. But then I realized my name had been added to it, not as part of the family, but as a category, a section labeled with a small dash, followed by notes like Evelyn's laundry, Wednesdays, and check with Evelyn before guests arrive, as if I were something that needed to be managed, scheduled, and accounted for. I stood in front of that list longer than I should have, reading each line twice, not because I did not understand it, but because I was trying to find some other meaning in it, something softer, something that would make it feel less deliberate than it clearly was. Michael walked in while I was still standing there, and for a moment, our eyes met, and I saw something flicker across his face, something that looked almost like recognition, as if he knew exactly what I was seeing, but instead of saying anything, he simply reached past me, grabbed a bottle of water, and left the room without a word. That silence told me more than any explanation could have. Later that afternoon, I decided to step outside for a while, partly because I needed air and partly because I wanted to see if the world beyond those walls still felt the same, and as I walked down the driveway, I noticed that even the mailbox had been changed. The name on it now reading Harper Family in a newer, sharper font, the small detail catching my attention in a way that felt disproportionate but unavoidable, because for years, that box had held my name, my husband's name, a quiet acknowledgement of the life we had built together, and now it had been replaced with something broader, something that included me only in theory, not in practice. When I returned, Vanessa was in the living room, speaking on the phone, her voice light and pleasant, describing the house to someone, mentioning upgrades, possibilities, even referring to one of the rooms as a future office space, and when she noticed me, she paused just long enough to lower her voice, turning slightly away as if to create distance between her conversation and my presence. I moved past her without interrupting, heading back toward the guest room, but not before catching a single phrase that lingered in the air longer than the rest. We are making it fully ours now, and that word, ours, settled somewhere deep in my chest, heavier than I expected. That evening, dinner was quieter than usual, and I found myself listening more carefully than before, noticing how decisions were framed, how plans were discussed, how my absence from those conversations was not questioned but assumed, and at one point, Vanessa mentioned rearranging the storage space in the garage, suggesting that some older items might need to be donated or discarded, and although she did not look directly at me, I understood exactly what she meant. I set my fork down slowly, not because I was finished eating, but because I needed a moment to steady my hands, and when I looked up, Michael was watching me, his expression unreadable, caught somewhere between concern and avoidance, and for a brief second, I wondered if he might say something, if he might interrupt, correct, or even soften what had just been implied, but instead, he simply nodded along, agreeing with Vanessa as if the decision had already been made long before this. Conversation began. I went to bed earlier than usual that night, not out of fatigue, but because I no longer knew where to place myself in the spaces we used to share, and as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I began to piece together the quiet sequence of changes that had brought me here, each one small enough to ignore on its own, but together forming something unmistakable, something that no longer allowed me the comfort of doubt. And as that realization settled in, steady and unyielding, I understood that what was happening was not accidental, not temporary, and not something that would correct itself with time. It was a shift, deliberate and complete, and I was standing on the outside of it, looking in. That night, I could not sleep, not because of noise or discomfort, but because my mind kept returning to memories I had not revisited in years, memories that once brought warmth but now felt sharper, almost like they had been waiting for this moment to be understood differently. I lay there staring at the ceiling, tracing the faint cracks in the paint, and I found myself thinking about the day we first bought this house, the way my husband had stood in the empty living room with a measuring tape, already planning where everything would go, already imagining the life we would build inside those walls. We did not have much back then, just enough savings for a modest down payment and a willingness to work harder than we ever had before, and I remember how proud we were when we finally held those keys in our hands, how we walked from room to room like it was something fragile and sacred, something that belonged to us because we had earned it. Michael was just a little boy then, running across the hardwood floors in his socks, his laughter echoing through the empty space before it was filled with furniture, before it was filled with years. I remember painting his bedroom myself, choosing a soft shade of blue because he said it reminded him of the sky, and I remember staying up late sewing curtains while my husband fixed a loose cabinet door in the kitchen, both of us working quietly, side by side, building something that felt permanent. For decades, that house held every version of our lives, birthdays with candles that burned down too quickly, Holidays where the table was too full and the laughter too loud. Quiet evenings where nothing happened at all except the comfort of knowing we were together. Even after Michael grew up and moved out, the house never felt empty, because it still carried the weight of everything we had lived through, every sacrifice, every small victory that had shaped us into a family. When my husband passed, I thought the silence would be unbearable, but it was not the silence that hurt the most. It was the absence of the person who had shared that space with me, the one who understood what every room meant without needing it explained. Still, I stayed, because the house was more than wood and walls. It was memory, it was history, it was proof that we had built something lasting. And when Michael suggested that transferring the house would make things easier, that it would protect me, I believed him, not because of the paperwork, but because of everything that had come before it. Because I thought those years meant something that could not be undone by a signature. Lying there in that small guest room, I began to understand how wrong that assumption had been, how easily meaning could be stripped away when ownership changed hands, how quickly memory could be replaced by convenience. I realized that what I had given was not just property, it was control, it was authority, it was the quiet understanding that this place had been mine to protect, mine to define, and without it, I was left with nothing but recollection. Something that could be dismissed, overlooked, or slowly erased. The next morning, I found myself moving through the house differently, not as someone who belonged there, but as someone observing it from a distance, noticing details I had never paid attention to before. The way the light hit the kitchen counter at a certain angle, the faint mark on the wall near the staircase, where Michael had once measured his height year after year. The small imperfections that had once felt like part of its character, but now seemed like evidence of something slipping away. And as I stood there, quietly taking in what remained of the life I had built, I felt something shift inside me, not anger, not even sadness, but a kind of clarity that settled slowly and firmly, like a truth I could no longer avoid. That everything I had trusted, everything I had believed would hold me steady, had already changed, and I was only just beginning to see the full shape of it. By the end of that week, the distance between me and my son had grown into something I could no longer ignore, not because of anything dramatic or explosive, but because of the quiet absence of the things that used to exist between us. The small conversations, the unspoken understanding, the way he used to look at me as if I were someone steady in his life, someone he could rely on without question. Now, when he spoke to me, it felt measured, careful, like he was choosing words that would not create tension rather than words that came naturally, and there was always a subtle glance toward Vanessa, as if he needed confirmation that whatever he said was acceptable. I noticed it one evening when I asked him a simple question about his day, something I had asked countless times before, and instead of answering right away, he hesitated, looked toward the kitchen where Vanessa was standing, and then gave me a brief response that ended the conversation before it could begin. It was not the words themselves that hurt, it was the shift, the way something so ordinary had become unfamiliar. I found myself remembering a different version of him, the boy who used to sit at the kitchen table with his homework spread out in front of him, asking for help, trusting that I would have the answers or at least the patience to find them together. Back then, he did not need to look anywhere else for approval. He did not measure his words. He simply spoke, and I listened, and that was enough. Now, I felt like a visitor trying to find the right moment to speak, unsure of where I fit in a space that had once been defined by our connection. The realization settled slowly but firmly, not as a sudden shock, but as a series of quiet confirmations that built on each other until there was no room left for doubt. I saw it in the way plans were made without including me, in the way decisions were presented as final rather than discussed, in the way my presence seemed to require adjustment instead of belonging. One afternoon, I overheard Vanessa talking to someone on the phone again, her tone light but precise, explaining that they were reorganizing the household and that certain changes were necessary for efficiency, and as she spoke, I understood that she was not just describing the house, she was describing a system, one where everything had a place and a purpose, and anything that did not fit would eventually be moved aside. Later that same day, I tried to speak with Michael alone, catching him as he was about to leave for work, hoping for a moment of clarity, a chance to understand what he was thinking, what he was allowing to happen, and for a brief second, it seemed like he might actually listen. He paused, his hand on the door, and I saw something familiar in his expression, something that reminded me of the boy he used to be, but it disappeared just as quickly as it came, replaced by a look of quiet discomfort. He told me not to worry, that everything was fine, that I was overthinking things, and his words were calm, almost rehearsed, but they carried no weight, no reassurance, just a sense of dismissal that felt more final than any argument could have been. I nodded, because I did not know what else to do, and he left without looking back, the door closing behind him with a soft click that seemed louder than it should have been. Standing there in the hallway, I realized that the connection I had relied on for so many years was no longer something I could reach simply by speaking. It had been replaced by something else, something distant and controlled, something that did not require my presence in the same way it once had. And in that moment, I understood that whatever I had lost was not just the house, it was the place I had held in my son's life, something far more difficult to measure and far more difficult to reclaim. The following morning, I decided to do something I had not done in years, something my husband used to handle without ever making it feel like a burden, and that was to look through the paperwork we had kept tucked away in the old filing cabinet in the hallway, the one that Vanessa had not yet reorganized or replaced. I moved slowly, not because I was unsure of what I was doing, but because I was beginning to understand that every step I took now needed to be deliberate, careful, and quiet. The drawer opened with a soft resistance, the same way it always had, and inside were folders labeled in my husband's handwriting, neat and consistent, each one holding pieces of a life that had once been shared but was now mine to understand alone. I sat at the small desk by the window and began sorting through them, not searching for anything specific at first, just reacquainting myself with the details I had trusted someone else to manage for so long. Mortgage statements from years ago, insurance policies, tax returns, documents that recorded the steady progress of a life built over decades, each one a reminder that nothing we had created had been accidental. As I moved from one folder to the next, I started to notice something else, something I had overlooked before, small notes in the margins, dates circled in pen, references to accounts and transfers that I did not fully recognize. Details that suggested my husband had been thinking ahead in ways I had not fully appreciated at the time. I paused, holding one document a little longer than the others, reading it twice, then a third time, letting the words settle in my mind as their meaning slowly became clearer. It was not something obvious or dramatic, not a hidden fortune or a sudden revelation, but it was enough to shift something inside me, enough to make me realize that the situation I was in might not be as simple as it appeared on the surface. I leaned back in the chair, looking out the window at the quiet street beyond, and for the first time in days, I felt something different from the heaviness that had been sitting in my chest, something steadier, more focused. Later that afternoon, I decided to leave the house again, not to escape, but to act, to take a step outside the boundaries that had been quietly drawn around me. The drive to the bank was familiar, a route I had taken many times before, though usually in the passenger seat while my husband handled the conversations, the decisions, the details. This time, I walked in alone, the air inside cool and still, the sound of quiet conversations and soft footsteps creating a calm that felt almost out of place compared to everything else that had been happening. When I sat down across from the bank representative, I spoke carefully, explaining that I needed to review my accounts, that I wanted to understand exactly what was in my name, and as she began to pull up the information on her screen, I watched her expression shift ever so slightly, not dramatically, but enough for me to notice. She asked a few questions, clarifying details, confirming my identity, and then she turned the screen slightly toward me, pointing out accounts I had not been fully aware of, balances that were larger than I expected, structures that had been set up over time without my full understanding. I listened quietly, asking only what was necessary, absorbing the information piece by piece, letting it form a clearer picture of what my husband had arranged, what he had protected, what he had left behind without ever needing to explain it in full. When I left the bank, The sunlight felt different, not warmer or brighter, but sharper, as if I was seeing things with a clarity that had been missing before. I sat in my car for a moment before starting the engine, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, and I realized that while I had been losing ground inside that house, something else had been waiting, something that had not been touched, not been taken, not been controlled by anyone else. And for the first time since I had signed those papers, I understood that I was not as powerless as they believed, and more importantly, I was not as powerless as I had allowed myself to feel. When I returned to the house that afternoon, nothing looked different on the surface. The same furniture, the same quiet hum of the refrigerator, the same faint scent of Vanessa's candles drifting through the living room, but I felt different moving through it, as if I were no longer reacting to what was happening, but observing it with a clarity I had been missing before. Vanessa was at the kitchen counter again, scrolling through her phone, and she glanced up briefly as I walked in, offering the same polite smile she had perfected over the past few weeks, the kind that acknowledged my presence without inviting anything further. I returned the gesture, matching her tone exactly, not out of habit this time, but with intention, and I could see, just for a moment, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, as if she sensed something had shifted even if she could not yet define it. Michael came home later than usual that evening, his footsteps heavier on the stairs, his voice carrying a trace of tension as he greeted Vanessa, and I listened from the hallway as they spoke in low tones about something that had not gone according to plan, something about a delay, a complication. Words that hinted at frustration without revealing the full picture. I did not interrupt. I did not make my presence known. I simply stood there for a moment, letting the sound of their conversation settle, recognizing that whatever they were dealing with, it was something they believed I had no part in, no right to understand. At dinner, the conversation remained surface level, brief exchanges about schedules, errands, small details that filled the space without creating connection, and I noticed how easily I could now sit in silence without feeling the need to fill it. How the absence of inclusion no longer surprised me, it simply confirmed what I already knew. Later that night, after they had gone upstairs, I returned to the hallway cabinet and opened the drawer again, this time with purpose, selecting the documents I had reviewed earlier and placing them neatly into a folder of my own, separating them from the rest, creating a boundary that had not existed before. I moved quietly, not out of fear, but out of strategy, understanding that there was no need to announce what I had learned, no advantage in revealing anything before I was ready. The next morning, I made a small change, something that would have seemed insignificant just days before, but now felt deliberate. I placed my coffee mug at the center of the table instead of the far end, not waiting for permission, not explaining the gesture, simply taking the space as if it still belonged to me. Vanessa noticed immediately, her eyes flicking to the mug, then to me, her expression tightening just slightly before she forced it back into something neutral, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. Michael walked in shortly after, glancing between us, sensing the tension without understanding its source, and I watched him carefully, noting the way he hesitated, the way he seemed unsure of where to direct his attention, as if the balance he had grown comfortable with was beginning to shift in a way he had not anticipated. I said good morning in the same calm tone I had always used, and when he responded, there was a subtle difference in his voice, a hint of uncertainty that had not been there before. Throughout the day, I continued in the same quiet manner, moving through the house with intention, observing their reactions, noting the small ways in which control was maintained, and more importantly, the small ways in which it could be challenged without confrontation. I did not argue, I did not accuse, I did not raise my voice, because I no longer needed to prove anything to them. I only needed to understand the full extent of what had been taken and what remained within my reach. And as I moved through those familiar rooms with this new awareness, I realized that while they believed they had already secured everything, they had overlooked something essential, something that could not be seen in a title or a document alone, something that required patience, timing, and a willingness to wait until the right moment to act, and for the first time since everything began, I was no longer reacting to their decisions. I was preparing for my own. Over the next few days, I stopped waiting for things to happen and began quietly putting pieces into place, not in a way that anyone could notice, but in a way that would matter later, when it counted. Each morning, I followed the same routine I always had, making coffee, sitting at the table, moving through the house with the same calm presence. But beneath that routine, there was a new layer of intention guiding everything I did. I began organizing my documents more carefully, not just the ones in the hallway cabinet, but everything I could access: bank statements, account numbers, old correspondence, anything that connected back to decisions my husband had made. Anything that might explain the structure I had only just begun to understand. I made copies where I could, storing them in a small folder that I kept out of sight, not because I was afraid of losing them, but because I understood that knowledge held quietly is far more powerful than knowledge announced too soon. At the same time, I paid closer attention to the rhythms of the house, when Vanessa made her calls, when Michael left for work, when the house was empty, learning their patterns the way I once learned Michael's schedule when he was a child, not out of control, but out of care, except now that care had taken on a different purpose. One afternoon, while Vanessa was out and Michael was still at work, I made a call of my own, not to the bank this time, but to a lawyer whose name I had found among my husband's old files, someone he had worked with years ago. My voice was steady as I introduced myself, explaining only what was necessary, that I needed to review certain documents, that I wanted clarity on what remained in my name and what rights I still held. The man on the other end did not ask unnecessary questions. He simply scheduled a meeting, his tone professional and measured, as if situations like this were not uncommon, which in a strange way brought me a sense of calm. When I ended the call, I sat there for a moment, holding the phone in my hand, realizing that for the first time since everything had changed, I had taken a step that was entirely my own, one that did not require approval or permission. That evening, nothing outwardly shifted. Vanessa spoke about small things, dinner plans, errands, adjustments she wanted to make to the house, and Michael listened as he always did, nodding, agreeing, moving along with her decisions without question. But I noticed something new, something subtle, a slight hesitation in Vanessa's tone when she spoke about future plans, as if she was beginning to sense that not everything was as settled as she believed. I did not challenge her. I did not correct anything she said. I simply listened, allowing her to continue under the assumption that control was complete. Later that night, I reviewed my notes again, the documents spread carefully across the small desk in my room, each one now carrying more meaning than it had before, forming a clearer picture of what had been set in motion long before I ever signed those papers. There was a structure to it, a design that had been built quietly over time, one that I had only just begun to see, and as I traced those details, I realized that what my husband had left behind was not just protection, it was a foundation, something that could still be used, still be activated, if handled correctly. I closed the folder slowly, placing it back where no one would think to look, and as I turned off the light, I felt something settle into place inside me, not anger, not fear, but a quiet certainty that the situation I was in was no longer something I had to endure without response. They believed they had already secured everything, that the outcome was final, but they had made one critical mistake. They had assumed that I would remain exactly as I had been, passive, trusting, and willing to accept whatever was given to me. And as I lay there in the dark, listening to the silence of a house that no longer felt like mine, I understood that assumption would be the one thing they would not see coming. The meeting with the lawyer was scheduled for late morning, and I arrived 10 minutes early, not out of nervousness, but because I wanted a moment to sit quietly and observe, the same way I had begun to observe everything else in my life. The office was modest, with neutral walls and a steady hum of activity behind closed doors, and when I was finally called in, the man who greeted me did not waste time on pleasantries. He simply gestured for me to sit and asked me to explain what I needed. I placed the folder on the desk, opening it carefully, and for the first time since all of this began, I spoke plainly, not emotionally, not defensively, just with clarity, explaining the transfer of the house, the changes that followed, and the documents I had found. He listened without interrupting, his expression steady, occasionally nodding as he reviewed the papers in front of him, and when he finally spoke, his words were measured but precise, confirming what I had begun to suspect but had not yet fully understood. The transfer of the house, while significant, was not the complete picture. There were provisions, structures, and accounts that had been established in a way that maintained certain controls and protections, things that had not been affected by the single document I had signed. He pointed to specific clauses, explaining how ownership and authority could exist in layers, how certain decisions still required consent, how access to broader assets was not as unrestricted as it might appear on the surface. I listened carefully, asking only what was necessary, each answer adding another piece to the structure I was beginning to see clearly for the first time. When the meeting ended, I did not feel overwhelmed. I felt grounded, as if something that had been uncertain was now defined. Something that had been slipping away was now anchored in a way I could work with. I left the office with a smaller set of documents, copies of key pages, notes written in careful detail, and as I walked back to my car, I realized that the balance of the situation had shifted, not outwardly, not in a way anyone else could see yet, but internally, in a way that mattered far more. That evening, I returned home at the same time I always did, entering through the front door with the same calm expression, placing my bag in the same spot, moving through the house as if nothing had changed. Vanessa was in the living room, reviewing something on her laptop, and she glanced up as I passed, her eyes narrowing just slightly before she returned to her screen, and I understood that she was beginning to notice the difference, not in what I was doing, but in how I was doing it. Michael came in shortly after, his routine unchanged, his tone polite but distant, and as we sat down for dinner, the conversation followed its usual pattern, light, controlled, predictable. At one point, Vanessa mentioned a plan to make further changes to the house, discussing timelines, renovations, adjustments that would require coordination, and as she spoke, she did not look at me. She spoke as if the decisions had already been finalized, as if there were no remaining variables to consider. I listened quietly, letting her finish, and then I asked a single question, not confrontational, not emotional, just direct, asking how those changes would be handled in relation to existing agreements and approvals. The room went still for a moment, not dramatically, but enough to shift the air, and Vanessa looked at me with a brief expression of confusion before responding, her tone still controlled but slightly sharper, explaining that everything had already been taken care of. I nodded slowly, accepting her answer without challenge, but I did not lower my gaze. I held it steady, just long enough to let the question remain in the space between us. Michael glanced between us, his expression tightening, as if he sensed something beneath the surface, but could not quite grasp it, and for the rest of the evening, the conversation stayed unusually brief, each word measured more carefully than before. Later that night, as I sat alone in my room, reviewing the notes I had taken, I understood that the moment had passed exactly as it needed to, not revealing anything, but introducing just enough uncertainty to unsettle what had previously felt certain to them. They still believed the structure was entirely in their control, that the decisions had already been made, but now there was a small fracture in that belief, a question that had not been there before, and sometimes that is all it takes to begin shifting the direction of something that once seemed fixed. The following week, I began to move with a level of precision that felt unfamiliar even to me, not because I was uncertain, but because I understood that every step now carried weight, every action needed to align with something larger than the moment itself. I returned to the lawyer's office once more, this time not to ask questions, but to begin setting things in motion, reviewing the options he had outlined, the mechanisms that had been quietly built into the structure my husband left behind. There were limitations, of course, but there were also conditions, requirements that had to be met before certain changes could be made, approvals that could not be bypassed as easily as Vanessa seemed to believe. I listened carefully as the lawyer explained the process, the timelines, the points at which intervention could occur, and when I left, I carried with me not just information, but direction, something I could act on without hesitation. Back at the house, The atmosphere had shifted again, though not in a way that could be easily named. There was a subtle tension beneath the surface, a quiet awareness that something had changed, even if neither of them could fully identify what it was. Vanessa had become more deliberate in her movements, more attentive to details, checking things twice, making calls in a slightly lower tone, as if she were trying to maintain control over something that felt less stable than before. Michael, on the other hand, seemed more distant, his focus divided, his conversations shorter, as if he sensed the imbalance, but did not know how to address it. That evening, they brought up the topic of finalizing certain decisions regarding the house, framing it as a necessary step, something that needed to be completed soon to avoid complications later. Vanessa spoke with confidence, outlining her plans, her expectations, her timeline, and as she did, I listened without interruption, allowing her to lay everything out as if it were already decided. When she finished, there was a brief pause, the kind that usually signals agreement, but this time, I did not fill it with silence. I spoke calmly, not raising my voice, not changing my tone, simply stating that before anything moved forward, I would need to review the relevant documents and confirm that all required conditions had been properly addressed. The shift in the room was immediate, not loud or dramatic, but undeniable. Vanessa's expression tightened, her confidence faltering just slightly as she processed what I had said, and for the first time since this began, she did not respond right away. Michael looked at me, then at her, his uncertainty now visible, no longer hidden behind polite agreement. Vanessa finally spoke, her tone controlled but edged with something sharper, insisting that everything had already been handled, that there was no need for further review. But I did not argue, I simply repeated, just once, that I would need to confirm it myself. That was all it took. The conversation ended shortly after, not with resolution, but with a quiet tension that lingered long after we left the table. Later that night, I sat alone again, reviewing the steps ahead, the documents I would need, the timing of each action, and I realized that the balance had shifted further than they understood. They had operated under the assumption that once the house was transferred, the process was complete, that there would be no need for further consent, no remaining conditions to satisfy. But they had overlooked the details, the layers that had been put in place long before any of this unfolded. As I closed the folder and turned off the light, I felt no urgency, no need to rush, because I understood something they did not, that control is not always about what is visible. It is about what remains unseen until the moment it matters most. And that moment was getting closer with each passing day. The moment came sooner than I expected, not because I rushed it, but because the situation had reached a point where it could no longer continue in the quiet, controlled way Vanessa had been managing it. She announced it over dinner, her tone composed, her posture confident, explaining that she had scheduled a meeting with a contractor to begin the renovations she had been planning, outlining changes to the layout, the removal of certain fixtures, even discussing how the guest room would be repurposed once everything was complete. She spoke as if the outcome had already been agreed upon, as if the process was simply a formality, and as she listed each detail, I noticed the way Michael nodded along, his agreement automatic. His attention focused more on her than on the implications of what she was saying. I waited until she finished, allowing the silence to settle just long enough to make space for what I was about to say, and then I placed my fork down carefully, folding my hands in front of me, not as a gesture of hesitation, but of control. I told her, in the same calm tone I had used from the beginning, that before any work could begin, there were conditions that needed to be reviewed and approvals that had not yet been secured. She looked at me, her expression shifting from confidence to something sharper, something closer to irritation, and she responded immediately, insisting that everything had already been handled, that the paperwork was complete, that there was nothing left to discuss. I did not raise my voice, I did not argue. I simply reached for the folder I had brought with me, placing it on the table and opening it with deliberate care, turning it so that both of them could see. I pointed to the specific sections, the clauses that outlined shared authority, the provisions that required consent before structural changes could be made, the conditions tied to broader financial controls that extended beyond the surface of ownership. I spoke slowly, not to emphasize my point, but to ensure there was no misunderstanding, explaining exactly what those clauses meant, what they required, and what would happen if they were ignored. The room grew still, not with shock, but with recognition, the kind that settles in when something believed to be certain is suddenly called into question. Vanessa's expression tightened, her confidence faltering in a way I had not seen before, her eyes moving quickly across the pages as if searching for something that would contradict what I was saying, but finding nothing that could dismiss it entirely. Michael looked between us, his uncertainty now fully visible, his earlier confidence replaced by a hesitation that spoke louder than any words he might have offered. Vanessa tried to regain control of the conversation, her tone sharpening as she questioned the relevance of what I was presenting, suggesting that these details were outdated, that they did not apply in the way I was describing. But I did not engage with her frustration. I simply stated that I had already consulted with legal counsel and that the interpretation was clear. That was the moment everything shifted, not outwardly, not in a dramatic display, but internally, in the balance of power that had been quietly assumed until now. For the first time, they were no longer operating from certainty. They were responding to something they had not anticipated, something they could not easily dismiss or override. I closed the folder slowly, not needing to say anything more, because the point had already been made. The structure they believed they controlled was no longer as stable as they had assumed. The rest of the evening passed in a strained quiet, each of us moving through the space with a heightened awareness of what had just taken place, and later that night, as I sat alone once again, I understood that this was not the end of anything, but the beginning of something they had not prepared for. A shift that would continue to unfold not through confrontation, but through the steady application of everything they had overlooked. The days that followed were quieter than I expected, not because the tension had disappeared, but because it had changed shape, settling into something more cautious, more calculated, as if every word, every movement now carried an awareness that had not been there before. Vanessa no longer spoke about renovations with the same certainty, her plans becoming less specific, her tone more measured, as if she were waiting for something, watching for an opening that no longer existed in the way she had assumed. Michael, on the other hand, seemed caught between two realities, the one he had been moving toward and the one that had suddenly revealed itself, and I could see it in the way he lingered longer in rooms, the way he started conversations but did not finish them, the way he avoided direct questions as if unsure of where they might lead. I did not push him. I did not ask for explanations or apologies, because I understood that whatever clarity he needed would not come from anything I said, it would come from what he was now forced to see. One morning, I sat at the kitchen table as I always did, my coffee placed in the center, the same quiet gesture that had once been contested but was now left untouched, and I watched as Vanessa moved around the room, her movements precise, controlled, but no longer entirely confident. There was a hesitation in her actions now, a subtle pause before each decision, as if she were recalculating something she had once taken for granted. When she finally spoke, it was not to assert control, but to suggest a discussion, a conversation about how to move forward, how to handle the situation in a way that worked for everyone, and I listened without interruption, not because I agreed, but because I no longer needed to respond immediately. When she finished, I simply told her that I would be reviewing everything with my legal counsel and that any decisions would be made based on those findings, nothing more, nothing less. She nodded, her expression carefully neutral, but I could see the shift behind it, the recognition that the certainty she had relied on was no longer hers to claim. That afternoon, I gathered my things from the guest room, not in a rush, not in a way that suggested I was leaving under pressure, but with the same calm intention that had guided every step I had taken since this began. I moved through the house slowly, pausing in each room not out of sentimentality, but out of acknowledgement, recognizing what had been built there, what had been lived there, and what no longer needed to be held in the same way. When I reached the front door, I set my hand on the handle for a moment, feeling the familiar weight of it, the years it had opened and closed under my care, and then I stepped outside into the afternoon light. I did not look back right away, not because I was avoiding anything, but because I understood that what I was leaving behind was no longer mine in the way it once had been, and what I was taking with me could not be confined to a place or a structure. I walked to my car, placing my bag in the passenger seat, and as I started the engine, I felt something settle into place inside me, not relief, not regret, but a quiet certainty that I had not lost everything as I once believed. Some things had been taken, yes, but not everything, not the understanding, not the control that still existed beneath the surface, not the ability to move forward on my own terms. As I drove away, the house grew smaller in the rearview mirror, just another structure on a quiet street, and for the first time in a long while, I was not looking at it as something I had lost, but as something I had outgrown, something that had revealed its truth in a way I could no longer ignore. And as the road stretched out ahead of me, steady and open, I realized that safety was never something that could be given or taken by anyone else. It was something I had to recognize, to protect, and ultimately, to define for myself.